is there any people you think about have to worry about the interference effect, shouldn't worry about the interference effect? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah. Are you familiar where the interference effect term came from?
I'm not actually.
So it was a professor from it would have been in the late 70s. He published a particular paper in the 80s, or 1980. He came from a research group where the lead professor was a very prestigious physiologist that really looked into endurance exercise. So to impress his professor, he would join him for his afternoon run. But he was a powerlifter. He continued his powerlifting training in the evenings. And then over time, he noticed that I'm starting to lose performance here. I'm starting to, things aren't going as well with my powerlifting training as I thought. So he mentioned this to his professor and he said, well, once you get your own lab, that should be your first research question. And that's what he did. So he created this study where he had a strength-only group, an endurance-only group, and a combined group. And what they found is that there was no real difference in endurance progression between the endurance group and the combined group. But when it came to comparing the strength group and the combined group, they found that both groups increased in strength, but the combined group reached around week 7 or 8, started to plateau, and by week 11, they actually decreased in performance, whereas the strength group started to continually rise. So his interpretation of that is that the addition of endurance training actually interfered with the progress of strength. So that's where the interference effect come from. And then from that, there's been many studies trying to look at the mechanisms behind why that is the case. And I think that had a big effect because people are trying to determine why there is effect rather than actually, is there an effect at all in many situations. This was back in the 80s. I'd say, from the year 2000, things have been much different in terms of research. With that original research, if you look into it a bit more deeply, the strength group did 5 sessions. The endurance group did 6 sessions a week. The combined group did 11 sessions because they just added the 2 programs on top of each other. So no wonder they got a bit, started to plateau. They're pretty tired by week 7, I think. So, and if you actually really look into the progression of the curve of the strength group, it's starting to round off at the top. If, it was 11 weeks, if it was 20 weeks, you might have seen a different answer. And this isn't me slating the study. This is me saying, this was the first thing, and it's great that they did this outrageous comparison because it allows us to draw many conclusions and ask many more questions. So since then, one of the key things which has been said is one of the main reasons of an interference effect is that you get different molecular responses from strength training as you do to endurance training. You've got something called mTOR, which is an enzyme which needs to be activated during resistance training, and obviously the inclusion of protein, all that type of thing, and that stimulates protein synthesis. And there's this idea that this other enzyme that gets activated, AMPK, activated during endurance training, because it's trying to regenerate ATP because you need more of it to keep going because it's endurance training, that it interferes with that molecular process for mTOR. It's a bit hit and miss in terms of the research. Some has shown that, it completely wipes out mTOR. Some has shown that there's no real, it doesn't seem to affect mTOR that much, or there may be an inkling towards the higher intensity and duration of the endurance work that may have an effect on mTOR, but it's not overly clear. And a lot of that is due to the fact that we're humans, we're very complex, different genetic expressions, all that type of thing. Very different to rats, where the original research came from, where they're much more uniform, and it did cut this mTOR off. But we've also got to be very aware that this affects at the muscle cell, but we've got lymph nodes, we've got the nervous system. They've got a number of different things that also is affected by endurance and resistance training. So it really only affects a small bit. So in terms of the molecular side, the interference effect could be well and truly happening, but you can still see improvements in performance, because that could be from the neuromuscular system. It could be from skill, learning whatever strength test that you've chosen, back squat, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So, so really, and that's just the molecular side. The rest of it is in terms of fatigue and all of those types of things, which we've kind of discussed. And I think for most novice athletes or even intermediate athletes, you won't really notice the effect of the interference effect that much. It could be marginal, but you probably wouldn't even notice it, because people don't notice it if they're still making progress. And if you're progressing slowly, you're probably not going to notice it. I think it really comes into effect when you're like an elite athlete and you're training a lot. Like elite athletes, to maintain that level of performance, need to train a lot and they need to train intensely. And that's when you need to start manipulating things a bit more thoughtfully to try and avoid any cross-contamination, even if it does occur. So that's when you got to start thinking about it more deeply. But for most people, and this is me included, I'm very much like an intermediate athlete. Unfortunately, my job and research don't allow me to train as much as many of the other people that you see on social media. I even with some of my own programming, I don't take into account some recommendations, because it's like probably not going to affect me that much.